The first thing the German women noticed in the American camp wasn't a guard. It was the smell of pancakes. The wind carried it like a mistake, warm and sweet, slipping through barbed wire and canvas seams, landing softly on the tongue before the mind could protest. Greta Weiss stood in line with her hands tucked under her elbows, shoulders drawn in, as if the morning itself could be taken away. The camp woke up in small, metallic sounds, a mess kit clinking, a boot heel scraping gravel, someone coughing into the cold. Somewhere beyond the fence, a generator hummed low and steady, like a patient animal. She had learned to measure days by ordinary things: roll call, ration tins, the angle of sunlight on the watchtower. But this was different. This was the scent of a Sunday kitchen, the kind that belonged to a world that no longer felt real. The women around her shifted, not speaking at first. They were used to silence, to swallowing questions whole. But a few eyes lifted, searching for the source as if it might be a trick hung in the air. The Americans had a way of doing things that felt casual, almost careless, and that made it harder to understand what was coming next. Greta had heard stories, some whispered in transit, some passed like contraband under breath, about camps that were clean, camps that were harsh, camps where kindness was another form of control. She did not know which version she had stepped into. She only knew that her stomach tightened at the wrongness of it. Butter and batter in a place built for waiting. A flap on the nearest kitchen tent snapped once in the breeze, and the smell thickened, richer now, touched with something sugary that reminded her of glass jars back home. Preserves, perhaps, or syrup. She watched a line of American soldiers moving between tents with practiced speed, not hurried, not cruel, just efficient. One of them, young, broad-shouldered, with a face that looked like it had belonged to a high school football team before it belonged to a war, carried a stack of tin plates. Another man worked a griddle, and the sound reached the women in faint bursts. A soft sizzle, a quick scrape, the flip. Greta's fingers flexed once, then stilled. Her breath came slow, controlled, a habit she'd built like armor. She refused to look hungry. Hunger could be read as weakness, and weakness drew attention. But the smell did something treacherous. It pulled memory forward without permission. A kitchen table, a chipped cup, a mother's hands moving with confidence. She pushed the images down, but they rose anyway, stubborn as steam. The women behind her whispered at last, one word in German, another in disbelief. Then fell quiet again when a guard's shadow crossed the ground. That guard did not shout. He simply watched, his expression neutral, his rifle untouched. The restraint was almost unsettling. It left room for imagination, and imagination was dangerous. Greta's gaze slid to the fence line, then back to the kitchen tent. A corporal stepped out carrying a tray, his uniform neat, his sleeves rolled. He paused, glancing toward the line of women as if measuring distance, not with contempt, but with calculation. Corporal Ethan Carter. She had heard his name once when a clerk called it out, and it had sounded too normal for a place like this. He said something to the cook, a short phrase she couldn't catch, then nodded once. The cook's shoulders loosened. The griddle kept singing. Greta didn't move, but inside, something shifted, a quiet alertness sharpening. In a camp built on scarcity and suspicion, the smell of pancakes was not comfort. It was a question. By the time the line inched forward, the smell had done what rumors always did. It had turned into a warning. Greta could feel it in the way the women held their shoulders, in the way chins lifted a fraction too high, like pride was the last ration no one could take. Someone behind her whispered that Americans liked to make a show of generosity. Someone else whispered that sweet food could hide something bitter. No one said the word poison out loud, but it sat between them anyway, heavy as a stone in a pocket. Greta kept her face still. She had learned that questions could be dangerous, and answers could be worse. In the distance, a flag moved lazily on its pole, the fabric snapping once and then settling, as if even the wind had decided to behave. The camp looked almost ordinary when the sun found it. Sand and packed dirt, white tents in neat rows, a water barrel with a ladle chained to it, a simple wooden sign stenciled in black letters. Order everywhere, the kind of order that pretended to be calm. But Greta had lived long enough under loud promises to distrust anything that seemed too tidy. She remembered the pamphlets, the speeches, the certainty that had been poured into young people like fuel. America was supposed to be loud and careless, a place of excess and cruelty in the stories she grew up with. Yet the men she saw were not laughing at them. They were not circling like wolves. They were working. That detail did not soften anything. It only made the situation harder to decode. When the women reached the front, a table appeared, plain and sturdy, the wood scarred with use. Tin plates were stacked in columns. A large metal container sat in the center, giving off a faint hiss of heat. Next to it were two smaller jugs, one labeled in English, the other with a handwritten note in rough German that made Greta blink. The letters were imperfect, but the effort was unmistakable. It made her throat tighten in a way she did not want to name. She watched Corporal Ethan Carter move with the tray in his hands, his eyes scanning faces without lingering too long on any one person. He did not grin. He did not stare. He looked like a man trying to complete a task correctly, the way a mechanic tightens a bolt to the right pressure. Greta noticed his hands. They were steady, not trembling with anger. They were hands that could have been passing plates at a church breakfast back home, if the world had not split open. A woman near the front reached out too quickly, then pulled back as if the air itself burned. Ethan paused, set the tray down, and spoke in a calm, even voice. Greta did not understand every word, but she caught the shape of it. Simple instructions, nothing theatrical. Eat. Wait. Move along. He pointed to a spot where they should stand after receiving their food, a small detail that mattered because it said this was not a game. It was procedure. Procedure meant predictability, and predictability meant fewer surprises. Still, Greta did not trust it. She watched the first plate slide across the table. 2 pancakes, round and thick, about the size of a man's open hand. A small square of butter on top, beginning to melt at the edges. The butter shone in the morning light like a secret. The woman who received it stared for a long second, as if the plate had spoken to her. Then she lifted her fork and paused again. No one breathed easily. Greta could hear the smallest sounds, a swallow, a sleeve brushing fabric, the distant clank of a pot. She could feel her own pulse in her fingertips. In the camp, even kindness could be a test. And Greta had promised herself she would never fail a test she did not understand. Greta reached the table at the same moment the griddle gave a louder sizzle, as if the camp itself was trying to sound cheerful. She stopped where the corporal had pointed, toes aligned with an invisible line in the dirt, and held her hands close to her body so no one could accuse them of trembling. Up close, the pancakes looked even more unreal. They were not thin. They were thick, nearly half an inch, edges slightly uneven the way handmade things always are. The butter on top softened into a glossy puddle that crept toward the rim. A sweet scent rose off the plate, warm enough to make her think of kitchens with curtains and clean floors, places that did not smell like canvas and dust. She forced her eyes away and looked at Corporal Ethan Carter instead. He stood behind the table with his sleeves rolled to his forearms, a simple wristwatch visible when he reached for the next plate. The watch face caught the sun. Time, measured and ordinary, on a man assigned to guard people who had been told they did not deserve ordinary. Ethan did not look at Greta like an enemy. He looked at her like a person in line, the way a clerk looks at customers when the store is busy and everyone just wants to get through the morning without trouble. He slid a plate toward her, careful, deliberate, and the metal made a soft scrape that felt too loud in the hush. Greta did not pick it up right away. She watched the butter melt. She watched a thin line of steam curl upward, then vanish. The woman beside her, older, with hair pinned back so tightly it pulled the skin at her temples, whispered, "Do not." Greta did not answer. She was not sure which word the warning meant. Do not eat. Do not trust. Do not show. Her stomach tightened again, but not with hunger. With calculation. She had survived by reading rooms, reading faces, reading what people did not say. She glanced toward the jugs. One was clearly coffee, the color dark behind the metal spout. The other was syrup, the label in English and that awkward German note, like a bridge built from scraps. Someone had taken time for it. That was the detail that kept snagging her thoughts. Time was the rarest thing in war, and here was time spent on handwriting. Ethan spoke again, slower now, his voice still even, and this time Greta caught enough to understand the intention, if not every word. He was telling them to move to the side after receiving food. He was telling them where to stand. He was telling them what came next. No jokes. No threats. It was procedure, calm and consistent, as if calm itself was a rule. Greta lifted the plate with both hands, feeling the heat seep through the tin. The warmth startled her more than the smell had. It made her fingers feel alive. She stepped to the indicated spot, careful not to spill, and watched the first woman who had received pancakes take a bite. Nothing happened. No cough. No sudden collapse. No shouted laughter from the Americans. The woman simply chewed, eyes widening a fraction as if her mouth had forgotten what soft food felt like. She swallowed slowly, like it mattered. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of listening. Greta realized everyone was listening not for screams, but for proof. Ethan leaned slightly forward, picked up a fork from the table, and without ceremony took a small bite from a pancake on a spare plate behind him. He chewed once, twice, then swallowed. His face did not change, but the message landed harder than any speech. He had eaten first. He had risked whatever they feared, in front of them, without demanding gratitude. Greta looked down at her own plate. The butter had melted completely now, a thin golden sheen across the surface. She could feel her heartbeat steadying, one careful beat at a time. In that moment, she understood the real danger was not what the food might do to her body. It was what it might do to her certainty. Greta held the fork as if it belonged to someone else. The metal felt too clean, too light, and the pancake under it yielded with almost no resistance. That softness made her hesitate. In her mind, softness had become suspicious. She cut a small piece, no bigger than a postage stamp, and watched it cling to the tines with a faint shimmer of butter. The smell rose again, closer now, wrapping around her like a blanket she did not remember agreeing to wear. Around her, the line continued to move, plates sliding, boots shifting, murmurs forming and dissolving before they could become full sentences. The older woman beside her still had not eaten. She stared at her plate as if it were an insult dressed up as breakfast. Somewhere behind them, a younger girl laughed once, a startled sound that stopped the moment it escaped, like she had broken a rule by letting it out. Greta raised the fork. Her throat tightened at the last inch, not from fear of the food, but from the idea of being wrong about everything she had carried across an ocean of propaganda and loss. She placed the bite in her mouth. The warmth hit first, then the taste, mild, sweet, comforting in a way that felt almost indecent inside a camp. The pancake was tender and slightly salted, the butter rich enough to coat the tongue, the syrup faintly vanilla, like something meant for children and slow mornings. Greta did not close her eyes. She refused the dramatic. She simply chewed, once, twice, slowly, letting her body collect evidence. Nothing sharp, nothing bitter, no hidden sting, just food, real food. Her jaw moved, and for a second, she heard herself, the simple sound of chewing in a place where dignity was often reduced to swallowing quickly and moving on. She swallowed. The bite went down and stayed down. No reaction, no trick. The realization did not arrive as relief. It arrived as confusion, then as a quiet pressure behind her ribs, as if something in her chest had been tightened for months and had suddenly loosened one notch. She looked up and found Corporal Ethan Carter still behind the table, coordinating the flow, nodding to the cook, keeping order with small gestures. He was not watching her for gratitude. He was watching the process for problems. That absence of hunger for praise made the act heavier. Greta took another bite, slightly larger, and felt her hand stop shaking without her permission. Around her, the camp shifted in small ways. A woman who had been rigid a moment earlier sat on an overturned crate and leaned forward over her plate as if to shield it from the world. Another lifted her pancakes with both hands and inhaled, not theatrically, but like someone checking whether a memory was still possible. Two women exchanged a glance that held an entire conversation. It is real. It is safe. Do not show too much. The older woman finally moved. She cut a piece, lifted it, paused, then ate. Her face did not soften into a smile. It hardened into something else, something like restraint battling gratitude. That fight played out in silence, because silence was the only language that did not feel compromised. Greta noticed the syrup jug again. The handwritten German label was crooked, the ink slightly smudged, as if the writer had pressed too hard or the paper had been damp. She imagined an American hand practicing the foreign letters, trying to get them right. The thought should have made her angry, but it did not. It made her careful. She poured a thin ribbon of syrup over the pancakes, watching it spread in slow lines. And in that slow movement, she saw a truth she had been avoiding. Cruelty was loud, but so was kindness, and sometimes kindness was the louder shock. The camp did not change in that moment. The fences stayed. The rules stayed. The war stayed. But inside Greta's mind, one old certainty cracked, and the crack let in light. After the last of the pancakes disappeared into cautious mouths, the camp did what it always did. It tried to return to routine. Plates were stacked. Tin cups were filled and refilled. The line thinned until only stragglers remained, women who had waited to see whether the first brave bites would be punished by fate. Nothing happened. That was the strange part. Nothing happened, and yet everything felt different. Greta sat on the edge of an overturned crate with her plate balanced on her knees, the wood pressing a straight line into the backs of her thighs. She ate slower than the others, not because she was savoring, but because she was studying herself. Each swallow was a vote. Each bite was a choice she had not expected to make inside a camp. Around her, the women began talking in fragments, low and quick, as if full sentences might attract attention. They compared the thickness, the sweetness, the way the butter melted like it belonged there. Someone said the American flour must be different. Someone said the syrup tasted like Christmas. Someone else snapped that nothing in a camp could be Christmas, and then went quiet, embarrassed by the sharpness of her own voice. Greta listened without joining. Her eyes kept drifting back to the serving table, to Corporal Ethan Carter, who was now wiping the edge of the griddle with a cloth and speaking to the cook in short, practical phrases. He moved as if this breakfast was not a statement, just a job, and that made it harder to turn into a story she could dismiss. When he lifted the syrup jug to check how much was left, the handwritten German label flashed again, crooked and earnest. Greta stood, plate empty, and walked closer without realizing she had decided to do so. She stopped at the edge of the table, just outside the invisible line of authority. The corporal glanced up, not startled, just attentive. His eyes were a plain color, the kind that did not promise anything. Greta felt the familiar temptation to appear smaller, to blend back into the group, to let silence protect her. But silence could also be a way of agreeing with lies. She pointed, lightly, at the German label. Her finger did not touch the jug. "You wrote that," she said in English, careful and slow, shaping each word like it mattered. Ethan's gaze flicked to the label. "Yes, ma'am," he answered, then corrected himself without apology. "Yes, I did." The word ma'am was a shock all its own. Not the syllables, but the habit behind them, the automatic respect. Greta had not been addressed like that in months. She did not smile. She simply nodded once, the smallest acknowledgement, as if she were marking a fact in her mind. "It is not correct," she said, then paused, measuring the risk of honesty. "But it is close." Ethan looked at the label again, brow tightening slightly, not in anger, but in concentration. "Close is all I got right now," he said. Greta could hear the American casualness in it, the way he made imperfection sound like a temporary condition instead of a shameful flaw. She hesitated, then took a breath that tasted faintly of syrup. "The second letter," she said, and pointed to the place where the line had bent. "It should be like this." She traced the shape in the air, not on paper, a careful gesture that asked permission without words. Ethan watched her finger draw the letter. He did not step back as if she were dangerous. He did not step forward as if he owned the space. He simply listened. Then he reached for a pencil, found a scrap of paper, and wrote the word again, slowly, matching her shape. The camp around them continued humming with noise, but in that small exchange there was a hush. Greta felt the eyes of the other women on her back, the silent question, "Why are you helping him?" She did not answer them, because she was not helping him. She was correcting something that mattered to her, something about being seen accurately. Ethan held up the paper for a second. "Like that?" he asked. Greta nodded once. "Like that." He set the corrected label aside as if it were important, not because it changed the syrup, but because it changed the meaning of the effort. Greta turned back toward the crates, her steps steady. She could feel it now, the new discomfort spreading through the camp like warmth. If an enemy could try to spell your language correctly, then the war was no longer made of simple shapes. The corrected label did not change the camp rules, but it changed the air between the women. When Greta returned to the crates, she felt the attention settle on her like dust. Not admiration, not anger, something more complicated. A younger woman with a scarf tied too tightly around her hair leaned in, as if to shield her words from the wind. "Why did you do that?" she asked in German, her voice thin with worry. Greta set her empty plate onto the stack and kept her hands busy, aligning the edges as if order could make the question smaller. "Because it was wrong," Greta said. The answer sounded too simple, so she added nothing else. In the camp, explanations could be turned into weapons. Across the yard, Corporal Ethan Carter attached the new scrap of paper to the jug with a piece of twine, his fingers moving with the same steady care he had used. With the plates, he did not look over for approval. That might have been the most unsettling part. He acted as if correctness mattered for its own sake. That kind of quiet discipline was not something Greta had been taught to expect from enemies. The morning moved on. The women were directed back toward their section, past the water barrel and the laundry line, past the low fence that separated one routine from another. Sunlight warmed the tops of the tents, turning the canvas bright, almost cheerful. Greta hated that cheerfulness. It tried to rewrite reality. Yet her body still carried the warmth of the pancakes, like a coal held in the palm without burning. As they walked, the conversations multiplied in murmurs. Some women insisted it was a tactic. Food today, demands tomorrow. Others argued that the Americans wanted to show the world they were better. One woman said they were trying to soften them for interrogations. Another snapped that no one interrogated women like them. Not here, not like that, and then fell silent as if she had said too much. Greta listened, but her mind kept circling one detail. Ethan had eaten first. He had not needed to. He had chosen to. Later, when the women reached their tent row, a guard waved them through with a bored flick of his hand. No shouting, no humiliation, just the motion of a man counting minutes until his shift ended. Greta stepped inside the tent and sat on her cot, the thin blanket folded with military precision at the foot. She stared at her hands. There was still a faint smell of syrup on her fingertips, sweet and stubborn. She rubbed her thumb against her forefinger, as if she could erase it. Outside, voices rose briefly, then settled. Someone laughed again, quieter this time, as if testing whether laughter was still allowed. Greta did not laugh. She reached under her blanket roll and pulled out a small object she kept hidden, not valuable in money, but valuable in meaning. A scrap of paper from a supply list that had blown loose weeks ago. She had saved it because it had English on it, words she had been trying to learn like a code. She smoothed it on her knee. Flour, coffee, sugar. She mouthed the words silently, shaping them with her lips, then stopped. Sugar. She had tasted it. Not in a dream. In a camp. The contradiction pressed against her ribcage again, demanding a new story. That afternoon, when the sun dipped and shadows lengthened across the yard, Ethan Carter walked the perimeter near their section with a clipboard, checking a posted schedule. Greta saw him through the tent opening, his posture straight, his expression focused. She could have looked away. She could have made herself invisible again. Instead, she watched him for one long breath. He paused near the fence, studied the paper, then tapped his pencil against the board as if thinking. When he turned, his gaze crossed the tent line and met Greta's for a moment. No smile, no threat, just recognition. In that small moment, Greta understood the real shift had already happened. The pancakes were gone, but the question remained, sharper now. If the enemy could be ordinary, then what else had she been wrong about, and what would that knowledge cost her to carry? The next morning, the camp smelled like wet canvas and boiled water, as if yesterday's sweetness had been a rumor the wind invented. Greta woke before the first call, staring at the seam lines in the tent roof where daylight leaked through in thin, pale strips. She could hear small sounds outside, a shovel scraping dirt, someone's boots pacing, a distant cough. Routine rebuilt itself quickly, brick by brick, because routine was safer than meaning. Still, as she stepped into the yard with the other women, she noticed how many of them were looking toward the kitchen tents even when they pretended not to. Curiosity had become a kind of hunger of its own. At breakfast, there was no syrup, no butter shining like a secret. Just oatmeal, thick and plain, served in tin cups that warmed the hands but not the heart. The disappointment was sharp enough to embarrass them. Greta watched a woman stir her cup with slow resentment, as if the spoon were accusing her of expecting too much. It was not the food that had changed them. It was the proof that comfort could exist here at all. Later, during a work detail, Greta was assigned to a supply area along with 3 other women. They carried folded canvas and sorted empty crates, moving items from one stack to another under the watch of a clerk who looked half asleep. The work was not difficult, but it demanded attention, and attention gave the mind too much room. Near the back of the supply area, a small chalkboard listed numbers in English, and Greta found herself reading them automatically. 10, 20, 50. Measurements. Counts. Ordinary math, the language of logistics. She was focused on a stack of flour sacks when she heard a voice behind her, calm and familiar. "Careful with that corner," Corporal Ethan Carter said, not loud, just clear. Greta turned. He was there with his clipboard, checking inventory, the pencil tucked behind his ear. The air smelled like dust and paper. He glanced at the stack she was moving and pointed to a frayed seam where one sack had started to tear. "If it splits, it is going to make a mess," he added, and the word mess sounded almost gentle in his American accent. Greta looked at the seam and then at his face. He was not correcting her to humiliate her. He was correcting the situation, the way a person corrects a loose nail before it ruins a whole board. Greta adjusted the sack with both hands and set it down more carefully. The tear held. Ethan nodded once, as if that small success mattered. One of the other women, Helga, muttered in German, "He thinks we cannot carry flour." Greta kept her eyes on the sacks. "He thinks flour is flour," Greta said quietly, and Helga went silent, unsure whether that was defense or warning. Ethan marked something on his clipboard, then paused as if he had remembered a detail from yesterday. "You said the letter should be different," he told Greta, and held out the pencil in an absent, almost awkward offer. "Can you show me again? I wrote it last night, but I am not sure it is right." The simple request landed like a weight. He was asking her for help. Not bargaining. Not demanding. Asking. Greta glanced toward the clerk, toward the guard line, toward the faces of the other women, and felt the old instinct to refuse anything that created a link. A link could be pulled like a chain. But she also felt something else, quieter, a stubborn refusal to let her own knowledge stay trapped behind her teeth. She took the pencil, held it the way she used to hold a school chalk, and on the edge of a blank form drew the letter slowly, once, then again, the curve cleaner the second time. Ethan leaned in slightly, careful to keep distance, watching the motion of her hand as if it were a map. "That helps," he said. "Thank you." He did not add anything dramatic. He did not make it sentimental. He simply took the paper back, studied it, then tucked it under the clip on his board like it belonged there. Greta handed him the pencil. Their fingers did not touch. The moment was small, almost invisible to anyone who did not know how to look for shifts in power. Then Ethan turned to the stack again and said, "We are short on coffee today, but there will be hot water." He said it as if he owed them information, as if transparency was part of his job. Greta watched him walk away, his boots leaving shallow prints in the dust. Behind her, Helga exhaled hard. "He talks to you," she whispered. Greta lifted another sack, feeling the weight settle into her arms. "He talks to the work," Greta answered. But even as she said it, she knew it was not entirely true. Something had started yesterday with a plate and a smell, and now it was spreading into the plain daylight of inventory and letters, into places where propaganda had no words ready. Greta kept moving, steady and quiet, because she understood the risk. The quieter the kindness, the harder it was to dismiss. By the end of the week, the camp had learned to hold 2 truths at once. The fences were real, and so was the smell of something good when the kitchen felt like making it. The women stopped calling it a trick out loud, but they still watched for hidden costs the way a person watches the sky for storms. Greta noticed the changes in small places. A few shoulders sat lower. A few voices stopped sounding like they were made of metal. Even the arguments shifted. They were no longer about whether the Americans were monsters. They were about why some men chose to act like they were not. On Saturday morning, a thin rain fell, turning the dirt into dark, sticky patches that grabbed at shoes. Work detail was postponed, and the women were told to stay near their section. The boredom that followed was dangerous. Boredom invited memory. Memory invited grief. Greta sat near the tent opening, watching raindrops stitch the yard into a single gray cloth. She heard footsteps and looked up. Corporal Ethan Carter was walking along the line with his clipboard tucked under his arm, rain speckling his cap. He stopped near the posted notice board, adjusted the paper pin there, and for a moment stood still as if listening to the camp breathe. Then he walked toward the kitchen tents, shoulders squared against the drizzle. Greta did not know why she followed with her eyes. She only knew she did. Later, around mid-morning, a call came that the women would be issued an extra item with their breakfast. The message traveled fast, passed in German from mouth to mouth with a mix of hope and suspicion. When they lined up, the rain had eased into a mist, and the kitchen tent glowed faintly from within, lantern light warming the canvas. Greta smelled it before she saw it, and her chest tightened again with that same unwilling recognition. Something sweet, something browned, something that belonged to a world where people argued about recipes instead of borders. The table was set up the same way, tin plates stacked, cups in rows. But this time there was a new object beside the syrup jug, wrapped in paper. A small stack of napkins, too, white and neat. The details felt almost ceremonial. Greta watched Ethan take his place behind the table. His sleeves were rolled again, the watch at his wrist ticking like it had not heard about the war. He did not announce anything. He did not try to impress them. He simply began sliding plates forward with that steady, careful motion. When Greta reached the front, he placed a plate in front of her with 2 pancakes and a small wedge of something pale on the side. She stared at it, confused. It was not butter. It was thicker, cut clean, and it held its shape. Ethan spoke quietly. "It is cream cheese," he said, as if he were naming a tool. "Some folks put it on, some do not. Your choice. Your choice." The phrase hit Greta harder than the food. Choice had become a rare currency. She could almost feel the other women listening for that word, measuring whether it was real. Greta lifted the napkin, unfolded it, and the paper crackled softly in the damp air. She set it on her knee like something precious. Then she looked at Ethan and said, in careful English, "Why?" Ethan did not flinch at the question. He glanced toward the cook, then back at Greta, and answered without drama. "Because it is Saturday," he said. He paused, then added, "And because you are still people." The sentence was plain, but it landed like a bell. Behind Greta, someone inhaled sharply. The older woman who had resisted last time tightened her jaw, as if refusing to let a single emotion show. Greta looked down at the plate again. Pancakes, cream cheese, syrup, in a camp. She understood then that the greatest shock was not sweetness. It was the quiet insistence on humanity in a place designed to reduce it. Greta picked up her fork, cut a piece, and spread a thin layer of cream cheese across the warm surface. It softened instantly, merging with the heat, the way certainty had begun to soften in her mind. She took a bite. The taste was rich and gentle, and for one moment she felt something like steadiness return, not because the war had changed, but because her own standards had. She looked up again. Ethan had already turned to the next person, repeating the same calm procedure, offering the same simple choice. Greta realized he was doing something dangerous in the safest way possible. He was making it harder for hatred to stay easy. The Saturday pancakes did not create peace, but they created a problem for hatred, and hatred did not like problems. In the days that followed, Greta watched the camp rearrange itself around that small act as if everyone were trying to place it somewhere safe. Some women treated the breakfast like a secret they refused to name, as if speaking it aloud would turn it into a lie. Others spoke of it too often, using it like a charm against fear. The arguments continued, but their edges dulled. The camp still had rules, still had fences, still had schedules pinned to boards in neat American handwriting. Yet now there was also a memory that did not fit the old story. Greta carried that mismatch quietly, the way she carried everything. One afternoon, a strong wind kicked up, rattling the tent lines and sending bits of paper skittering across the yard like startled birds. A supply notice tore loose from a nail and tumbled along the fence until it snagged on a low corner post, flapping hard. Guards did not chase it. They had learned that paper ran its own course. Greta saw it and walked toward it without thinking, stepping carefully through the dust. The paper slapped against the wood, the words blurred by motion. She reached out, steadied it with her palm, and read the top line. Inventory adjustment. Flour ration. Sugar allocation. The language of control written in polite terms. Behind her, Boots approached. She did not turn right away. She waited, listening to the weight of the steps. When she finally looked over her shoulder, Ethan Carter was there, holding his cap down against the wind with one hand, his clipboard tucked tight under the other arm. He stopped at a respectful distance, eyes on the paper Greta was holding in place. "It is going to rip if you let it flap," he said. Greta kept her palm flat against the notice. "Then pin it better," she answered in English. It was the closest thing to a sharp tone she had used with him, and she felt the other women nearby go still, waiting to see what punishment followed. Ethan did not react with anger. He nodded once, as if she had stated a simple fact. He reached into his pocket, pulled out 2 small tacks, and held them up. "I was coming to," he said. "You beat me to it." He stepped forward, careful, and held the top corner steady while she kept the bottom from tearing. His fingers moved quickly, pressing the tack in, then the second. The paper stilled. The wind lost its toy. For a moment, they stood side by side facing the notice board, not facing each other, which made the closeness less dangerous. Greta could smell the faint soap on his uniform, the kind used in American laundries, and it reminded her again of ordinary life. Ethan glanced down at the printed lines. "We got flour in," he said. "Not a lot, but enough." Greta heard the implication before he said anything else. Enough for pancakes again, someday. She did not let hope rise too fast. Hope was heavy when it fell. She kept her voice steady. "You do not have to," she said, meaning more than food. Ethan looked at her then, not long, just long enough to show he understood the deeper sentence inside the smaller one. "I know," he answered, "but I can." The other women were watching, but Ethan did not perform for them. He simply adjusted the edge of the paper once more, making sure it lay flat, then stepped back. Greta released her palm and felt the strange absence where the paper had been flapping, like quiet after a storm. She realized something in herself had changed as well. She no longer wanted to be protected by the simplest version of the world. The simplest version said enemies were always cruel and kindness was always a trap. The truth she had tasted was harder and therefore more honest. People made choices, even inside systems designed to erase choice. Greta turned to go back to her tent row. Her steps were measured, her face calm. Behind her, Ethan's pencil tapped once against his clipboard, a small sound, then stopped. Later, that night, Greta lay on her cot and listened to the camp settle into darkness. The wind had died, and the tents no longer snapped like flags. In the quiet, she understood what the pancakes had really done. They had not fed her body as much as they had fed her standard. She did not raise her voice. She raised the bar.